Hey everybody, I'm Daniel from Spacedock, and I thought I would do a ranking of the Star Wars The Old Republic class ships, the player ships, of which there are a few. 6, I believe, because I think there's some pretty great designs mixed in there, and they're worth some attention, so let's get right into it. In 6th place, the player ship for the Jedi Knight and Jedi Consular, the Defender class Light Corvette. I'm not a huge fan of this thing. It's fairly appropriate for the Republic designs of the era, which I've never been a massive fan of, but really, I think the Old Republic sets a very high bar for ship design. The Sith Empire has really fantastic stuff. The Terminus class and the Harrower class are, I think, some of the best Star Wars warship designs ever. The Republic is a little bit lower down on the scale. The Thranta Corvettes are okay. I'm not a huge fan of the big Valor class cruisers, but this ship, the Defender class, fits well into that sort of lineage. It looks a bit like one of the Thrantas turned sideways. It still has the hammerhead shape at the front, and the two big engines at the back. It's definitely got a clear lineage to Corellian designs from the original trilogy, the CR-90 Corvette and all that, but it just looks a bit too much like a big fire engine for my liking. It's just a bit blocky and bland. I think really it's mostly the merits of the other ships on this list that are putting this at the bottom. It's not the worst thing I've seen, but it's not that great either. It has a nice Jedi-style interior with meditation chambers and a good kind of amber beige colour scheme going on. It's very appropriate for the world building, it's very thought out and fitting, but just not as much of a fan of this as I am of the other designs, I would say. Next up, it is the Smuggler's XS Stock Light Freighter. This is your typical variation on the Millennium Falcon YT series style Star Wars design. I like it a lot. It inherited the blocky cockpit shape from the Ebon Hawk. It's inherited a few things from the Ebon Hawk, I would say, which is appropriate for the era. I like the sort of tapering shape of it. It looks very sleek. The off-center pod on the one side is very Millennium Falcon-esque. And the two large engines at the back I like. I've never been a huge fan of the Millennium Falcon itself. Sacrilege as that is, I know. I've always preferred the various other YT models to the Falcon, and I prefer the two large engines here to the curved engine strip of the YT-1300. I think my favourite YT series ship was always the YT-2000 from X-Wing Alliance, and this ship channels a little bit of that with the cockpit being centre-mounted, and it's just generally a pretty solid design. I like the yellow colour scheme. I like the large interior. I think this has the largest explorable interior of any of the player ships, possibly competing with the Bt7, I'm not too sure. But overall, it's a good design. I like that the entire first act of the Smuggler story is about reclaiming it. It places a lot more importance and emotional value on your ship than a lot of the other classes do, which is appropriate for a Smuggler story. All-round good design, a solid iteration in the many light freighters of Star Wars fame, which are always dubious at being freighters and seemingly just a delivery system for gun turrets, but what can you say? Next up, it is the Bounty Hunter's D5 Mantis patrol craft, which is very heavily inspired by the KSE Fire Spray, which makes sense. It is once again a rare patrol craft, much like the Fire Spray is, limited run law enforcement craft, which makes sense. Law enforcement style vehicles, especially outdated surplus ones, would be logical things for bounty hunters to use because they're likely to already have cells and stuff like that on board, and this ship does have a force cage and a small brig on board. Your typical kind of brutalist Slave One style interior design, with again more Slave One inspiration on the exterior with those yellow cowling colours and the green trim. But I would say overall I prefer this to the KSE Fire Spray. I've never been a huge fan of that ship. I prefer the more horizontal orientation of this ship. In fact, I would say that if you were to fix the Slave One, fix all of the problems that I have with it, the result would be something that looks pretty much like the D5 Mantis. Its 3 engine pods manage to keep the vertical shape and general vibe of the Slave One whilst actually having a more normal horizontal frame, which I think makes sense for an older ship that's not meant to have quite the same level of sophistication as Slave One. But also, I just don't like that sort of standing large aft silhouette kind of foldy thing that Slave One does. I prefer it just being able to land normally, which the D5 Mantis can. Again, it's just an era-appropriate design. It has that sort of stark Mandalorian helmet kind of feel that fits the whole bounty hunter vibe very well, while still being very era-appropriate. Generally just another example of really quality ship design in this game, I'd say. Across the board, excellent world building in terms of designing something that we know will eventually become the shape of Star Wars, and this ship contributes to that vibe very nicely. Next up, it is the Bt7 Thunderclap, which is my favourite Republic design from this era. I always get strong Mass Effect vibes, and it's not just because the Trooper character is voiced by Jennifer Hale, but But you do just feel like the commander of a sort of Spec Ops team delivery vehicle when you're playing the Trooper story. The Trooper story is, I feel, the weakest of the Old Republic stories, which again is a high bar to match. If you've not played the Old Republic, even if you're not into MMOs, I'd suggest playing them just for the story. The Imperial Agent story in particular is, I think, one of the best written stories the Star Wars brand has ever seen. It's definitely worth checking out if you get a chance. But the Trooper, not quite up there to the same standard, while still being quite fun, but this ship fits that vibe very well. It's kind of like a big B-Wing. It's like if you made a dropship out of a B-Wing. It feels very military, very down to the ground and utilitarian. It looks robust and powerful. I like the broad cockpit area and the style of the windows. I like the fact that I think it is the only 2-deck interior. Oh, the D5 Mantis is kind of 2-deck, but the Bt7 has a solid 2-deck structure with an entire separate deck for the bridge, and then a big operations room kind of level with a war room kind of table and a barracks off to one side and an armory and a sick bay. And it's just got a lot of Normandy vibes going on. Despite not being a huge fan of a lot of the Republic's designs in this era, I do like the beige and orange colour scheme they have going across the board, and it looks really good on this ship, I think. And I like the lore behind this ship. I know it's kind of an excuse for them to reuse the 3D model, but I like the idea that it was a Spec Ops ship, but it was so good at being just a combat ship that the Republic Navy started using them in their order of battle, and for that reason you occasionally see groups of them in the space battles in the game, like the larger fleet engagements, which is just sort of logical for the period, and it's the kind of thing that happens in real life, and I like that sort of world building. A lot of the time, it's those kind of limitations, like finding an excuse to reuse a 3D model, that create interesting world building justifications and make the world feel more real, and this is just another one of those. Final interesting little bit on this before we move on. This is a Rendili Hyperworks design, which is a very common Star Wars ship manufacturer, and the Defender-class corvette we mentioned earlier is a Rendili Vehicle Corporation design, which appears to be a sort of subsidiary of Rendili Hyperworks that normally make industrial equipment. One of the only other things that they're credited for having made is something called a boulder dozer, which is some kind of earth-moving, laser-cutting, debris-moving device. And it seems very strange that that weird industrial subsidiary got commissioned to do a Jedi corvette. But it also has kind of happened before in Star Wars. The Quasar Fire light carrier from the Galactic Civil War kind of period was made by a corporation that normally just makes yachts for rich people. So I guess these kind of interesting little commissions for unlikely corporations just happen sometimes in Star Wars, which again adds a bit of texture to the world, I feel. Moving on, it is the Fury-class Imperial Interceptor in second place. This will be a lot of people's favourite, and justifiably so. It's one of a few designs in Star Wars that try to bring the TIE fighter style to a larger ship, and I think that always works out really well, because the TIE fighter style has always been iconic. Other examples of ships that have tried to do this is the VT-49 Decimator, and the fantastic Raider-class corvette, which got its big kind of new cannon debut in Battlefront 2, and to a lesser extent the TIE Reaper, which I also really like. But all of these designs share that kind of bigging up of the TIE style, which just looks great every single time, I think. This thing looks sleek and mean. It looks like it was built by the same people who do all of the Imperial Navy's usual military stuff, but it also makes sense that it is a design specifically to be a personal starship for Sith assassins and Sith apprentices and stuff. Enough interior space for a small crew, still being maneuverable and aggressive enough to take part in battle. I think it's described as a mailed fist by the guy who designed it in-game, which is a really good way of putting it, because this thing just looks like it punches through formations and doesn't really care what's placed in its way. It's very characteristic of the Sith in that way, and I love when they're able to deliver that much character into a design and make it feel so appropriate. The interior has that sort of brutalist grey style, which is kind of lit by dim red lighting. Looks a bit like some of the temples in the game. In fact, it kind of looks like a Imperial warship's interior has been infected by a Sith temple, which is exactly what it should look like, really. It's, again, just quality world building. This thing looks good from almost every angle. It looks fast and deadly, and I've been a huge fan of it ever since it got its debut in that Return cinematic trailer where it drops off Malgus's master in that battle over Korriban. Really, really cool looking ship, and you would be well justified if this was your favourite. However, in first place is my favourite, the X-70B Phantom, which is essentially the result of what would happen if you tried to make a James Bond car in Star Wars. It looks like a yacht from most angles. It's got a bit of that kind of Nubian, kind of Naboo, kind of classy style to it, backlit by that nice blue trim neon lighting. It just looks really sophisticated, and it has that Aston Martin kind of vibe. There's no way this wasn't heavily inspired by Bond cars. It's a sensible source of inspiration for an Imperial Agent story ship, and the result has worked out really well. I love the kind of peaked bow where the hull extends forward and works like a cap over the front of the bridge windows, which are themselves kind of typical Imperial triangle, Imperial Star Destroyer style window ports. Look really good. I like the broad purple engine structures. It's a simple sci-fi kind of winged pointy thing kind of shape, but it's just done in a really, really stylish way. And the interior for this thing is gorgeous. I love all of the wood trim. I love that it extends that kind of comfortable yacht style all over the ship, maybe to the point where you could go undercover and pretend to be some kind of baron or something, and people could even board your ship and be invited to drinks on board your ship or whatever, while you're still maintaining the cover of being somebody else. It's never really apparent that this is an Imperial spy's ship. It could still be a well-to-do civilian transport, even on very close inspection, which I like a lot. I love walking around this ship in the game. I love all of the cutscenes of it taking off and landing and all that, and it's a perfect addendum to what I've already said is an overall excellent story. If I can go on a small tangent to talk about the Imperial Agent story, it's basically, I think a lot of people kind of ask for that Imperial viewpoint style story in Star Wars in general, and I feel like they were kind of robbed of that with Battlefront 2, which I think is a justifiable complaint because that game's story left much to be desired. But the Imperial Agent story is kind of like following the lives of the people who are keeping this empire running in spite of the fact that it is run by magic lunatics, which is a fascinating thing to do, an analysis of how does a Sith empire work. And a lot of the time you'll have situations where Imperial intelligence will set up all of their ducks in a row and get this big complicated operation underway, and then it will just be ruined by the fact that some Sith Lord somewhere killed some guy on a whim because he was stuck in traffic and annoyed, and that person turned out to be really important to this operation, and it all just falls apart. And obviously the Sith run everything, so the Imperial agents then have to just sort of like make do and avoid offending their bosses too much, whilst also keeping all of the infrastructure of this empire working. And it's just a really engaging story from that perspective, and it's written really well. It's written by, I think, the same guy who does the Alphabet Squadron books. It's definitely worth your time. The Old Republic has been set up in such a way now in recent updates that you get so much XP for doing everything that you don't actually need to do any MMO kind of stuff, really. You can just play the story, and I think that's very good, because I hope one day, when inevitably the servers run out of Steam, they do something to preserve these stories as single-player experiences, because they are really, really good, and you should check them out. And I realise I've deviated massively from spaceships in that particular tangent, but it is a great story and you should look into it. But yes, the X-70B Phantom, a gorgeous ship. I think the best of the player ships in the Old Republic. Almost the best ship design in general, I would say, from the Old Republic, beaten only by the Harrower and the Terminus, which are fantastic. Across the board, the Sith Empire looks great. All of the uniforms, all of the interior sets, all of the ships, their whole aesthetic is fantastic, and I love the subtle implication that Palpatine was just kind of cosplaying as them with his empire. All of his inspiration was taken from the real Sith Empire, and his ships and his uniforms and all that were modelled after these people who he's trying to emulate, and I love the sort of retroactive characterization that gives him as a bit of a pretender. It's a good way of doing it. Overall, the Old Republic is just a world-building masterclass, to be honest. They don't really put a foot wrong once. It's a great game from a great era, full of great ship designs. I hope the KOTOR remake stands up to the quality set by these earlier games, and I hope we get more kind of stuff like that in future. Here's hoping. But that's it for today. Thank you all for listening. Hope you enjoyed. And this is Daniel from Spacedock, signing off.